Honorable Prime Minister Samuel Hines, Minister Dr. Frank Anthony, our distinguished guest, Professor Verene Shepherd, members of the diplomatic community, distinguished guests, the media. I also want to acknowledge a lady of valor who is in the audience, Miss Magna Pollard. It's good to see you. A true hero. Lightning strikes only once. That's what we were taught in school. But over the last 4 weeks, lightning has struck thrice. For what a feast. Hilary Beckles, Alvin Thompson, Verene Shepherd. Those of us who are religious historians, we've had the Holy Trinity. And tonight, Professor Shepherd has enshrined for us a memorable 250th anniversary commemoration process. When these tapes are shared, we will realize what we have had. Her topic, of course, was a very important and welcomed one. United in anger, united in war, gender and anti-slavery in the Caribbean. Just a few weeks ago, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles reminded us that slavery was the perfect industry, that women gave birth to the next crop of free slaves, but we have forgotten the mothers who suffered daily, who sacrificed and survived. Tonight, Professor Shepherd reminded us of that. I'd like to summarize what she said, probably in a roundabout way. And of course, it's scary to follow someone of her reputation for her presentation. But she took us to Africa and back in terms of heroes. She mentioned Queen Nzinga, the warrior queen, Portuguese, who fought the Portuguese. She implied what Yaa Santawa from Ghana did when she said, when men were unwilling to fight, I shall call upon my fellow women, we will fight till the last of us falls. She brought us back to the Caribbean. Nani, Jamaican national hero. And to some extent, she reminded us of many Guyanese heroes. Most of us in the audience in Guyana have never heard of African Jeanette, a young princess from the Gambia who was a house slave in Guyana on a plantation of ivory, who was a very good cook. She had learned about herbs and medicines in Africa, and her form of resistance was to poison her enslavers. Most of us in Guyana never heard of her. We often hear about the 100 million tons of earth that African slaves dug with their hands. We had no machines at the time to build Guyana. But we also forget that women were central to that. Professor Shepherd's opening statement was significant after she heard an incredible, I guess her bio read by Tota Manger. She said her mother would have been proud because they worked hard, women in the past worked hard and continue to work hard to ensure the freedoms we never had. We've often forgotten our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents. So I'd like to thank Professor Shepherd for reminding us of that. Our freedom today is because, she said, of the sacrifices of indigenous people who fought for freedom and left us a legacy of resistance, and to African women who fought in valor. She asked the question, who can swallow the indigestible fish bowl of slavery? And she told us that every form of bondage generated equal resistance force. She reminded us that women were a fundamental part of the anti-slavery movement, and she asked the question, what is the political value of the argument that physical war was more important than the ideological preparation for war that women helped us to do? Professor Shepherd lamented that women today are not recognized during Emancipation or Black History Month or at any time, and that's an injustice that must be remedied. Most of our women who made sacrifices in Caribbean history are unknown. She mentioned many names: Cecilia, Amber, Susanna, Nanny, Patty, Nellie, Diana, Nancy Greer, Harriet Tubman, a leader from Suriname. And she used Bob Marley's song to say, we refuse to be what you wanted us to be. She told us about the brutality meted out to women and who dared to fight for freedom. Lashes galore for those who contemplated freedom. Yes, indeed, women were united in anger because conditions were vexatious to the spirit. We have forgotten, she said, Professor Shepherd, the historical role of women in mass organization to fight slavery. Women helped to create, she said, the psychological framework for Caribbean independence. They too were abolitionists. The slave system's greatest foes, she reminded us, as Eric Williams said, were the slaves themselves. She said that there was really no purely humanitarian explanation for the emancipation of slaves. Slaves fought for it, including women. She told us that we need to rescue the female ghosts that we have buried and to highlight their role in the anti-slavery movement. She said they've been ignored into anonymity. The female rebel past, she says, should become our present. She also told us about women's roles in the early capital accumulation of the Caribbean, and they were the moral force of the resistance, using ancestral spirits. Women, she said, were involved from the beginning, and she took us back into 1727 to Cuyabo, who was involved in resistance. She talked about the evils of slavery and what women went through: exploitation and sexploitation. And she said that the only reason for their activism, the main reason, was their quest for freedom. They were and are the heart of a family. She reminded us that unlike the history books, women did the major part of the field work, and that their symbolic value is not only misunderstood but undervalued. Their reproductive lives were appropriated. Many lost fingers and limbs and lives. Oftentimes we get lost in the contradiction between the roles of mother and work in the field. Professor Verene Shepherd gave us a litany of names of female slaves in Guyana and the Caribbean, lost in history, even though they were united in and on their shoulders, she said, even today, women are fighting historical structures of imperialism. She talked about, I am a free man woman, and no mother a cry. She asked the question, what have we done to honor women? She implored CARICOM and ministers and governments to raise their profile, to recognize the yin and yang of slavery. That without women, slavery would have been a much more difficult event for men. I've tried to synthesize in a few minutes a treasury of information that was presented to us by Professor Verene Shepherd. And that's an impossibility, given the scholarship, her passion, and the memory she left us tonight. She's given us a symbolic emancipation of our women. I hope we here tonight accept her challenge and do what is right. I thank you very much.
When we're thinking about where to position the monument, did you ever think it was going to be too small an area or something like that? When you decided, it was decided where to put it, and the artist, whoever was going to be commissioned to actually do the monument, what happened? What transpired for the monument to be there?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was no question about where it should be put, because this is the spot where the hangings took place. Most of the hangings took place here. And the space is much larger than it appears here. It is in the center of a really lovely area where people can go and lay a wreath. People can read the names, lament, cry. People have, it evokes all sorts of emotions to people. But we also think that because occurred and hangings occurred in other parishes, not just here,
Yes.
that similar monuments should be placed in the appropriate places around the island.
Thank you.
We also have an Emancipation Park in Kingston.
Yes.
It was established when we reintroduced Emancipation Day as a public holiday in 1997.
Yes.
And we are lobbying for the names to be inscribed on the wall of remembrance in Emancipation Park as well.
But it's a start.
It's a start.
We have a place called Parade Ground where we've had a lot of hangings for the 1823 insurrection. And we think, as most people here believe, that we should have the monument for the 1823 insurrection put there, because that's where most of the hangings took place, and they were just barbaric treatment meted out to the Africans there. They lost a lot of their lives. They're hanged and put on stakes or whatever, and yet somehow the monument was moved from there. But it should be, and I still believe it should be there, just as you have yours where the hangings took place. Thank you.
Next question, please. Yes, sir. I would like to know enslaved people, men and women, in those days, slaves, if they were found, they were either flogged or put to death. And when we look at the young generation today, especially in overseas, kids dropped out of high school, and so I would like you to shed some light on that. What's the reason for that?
Yes. I often lament the fact that our young people don't understand what their ancestors went through in order to bring them to this place today. And it is true that education was not something was encouraged under enslavement. Some enslaved people did manage to read and write. Not all were punished because of that. Samuel Sharp, who was a leader of the 1831-32 war in Jamaica, could read and write. The missionaries taught them to read the Bible. So when we think about that today, the difficulties that our ancestors had to go through in order to get access to some education, most of which came in the post-slavery period, I think we should ensure we don't squander the legacy. And a lot of our young people, especially our young boys, it's not cool to be educated and to be bright. But I say, what is not cool is to be ignorant and dunce.
lectures, I've started some research, matter of fact, from last year. And coming out from my research, what I found out is that from the information that I'm gathering currently is, and more or less the question is, how should I respond now? My research in terms of the Nile Valley Christianity.
I'm not sure what you're asking. How should you respond? Is it that you're... I'm not sure. What is the question? How should you respond? How
Yeah,
do you think you should respond?
Basically, based on the teaching
Yes.
from Christianity, religion, and God and creation concepts, and the doctrine in particular, the Nile Valley origin of Christianity, in essence, from what I'm gathering, vary. So basically, I'm asking.
You mean that's not taught, or
that is not taught in schools?
Yes.
In essence,
yeah.
Information like this is not taught in school.
Right, right.
Basically, I grew up that the only religion or true religion, and everything else is heathens and so on.
But of course, you know by now the diversity of religious belief and thought. And I think you also live in a country, people with different beliefs. And so I don't think that one single story about religion is acceptable anymore. And what is true though, is that our people and our young people have been socialized into thinking that Christianity is a Western concept. And also that in terms of the history of abolition, many of them believe it was a humanitarian struggle, that the missionaries were active in anti-slavery. What we should tell our children is that those missionaries who dared to say that enslavement was wrong were hastily deported or killed. And that religion was not presented to our ancestors or to our early people as something that was liberating. They had to figure that out for themselves, because they were taught to read the Bible. They figured it out after a while that Christianity was incompatible with enslavement. And so that's why we have to encourage our young people to read and to think for themselves and not to imbibe everything that is thrown at them.
Low shine bone and
Yes.
writer from this country.
That I know. You were being interviewed on one of the TV programs recently too, and we met some years ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to ask you a difficult question for which you might not be prepared. But as you know, the two major races in this country are African and Indian. And I know that you have done, David Aberdeen, the Guyanese historian, said that when slavery was abolished, African slavery was abolished, a new system of slavery emerged, which was East Indian indentureship. And I know that you have done a lot of research on the resistance of East Indian women to indentureship. I don't want to compare who suffered the most or who deserved monuments the most, but is there any prospect in Guyana of perhaps erecting a monument to women of both those races who resisted oppression through slavery and indentureship? I wonder if there's any scope for that.
Well, that's indeed a difficult question, in one sense, easy in another sense, because when I started my lecture, I spoke about the fact that every system of exploitation, every system of domination, whether it's enslavement of Africans or indentureship of Indians and Chinese, generates an opposing struggle for liberation. And it is true, when you read the works of history, of the voyages, of the plantation experience, you see that everybody resisted. But I really don't want to equate African enslavement with Indian indentureship or Chinese indentureship, because to me, that would be to underestimate the Middle Passage and what Africans went through. So I really can't do that. But there is nothing that says that everybody who built our Caribbean nation should not be singled out and lauded. In Jamaica right now, we have a Park of World Heroes. Gandhi's bust is there. In Old Harbor, where Indians first arrived, there is a monument. So we don't believe that we must exclude any group from being honored. And certainly, all groups resisted. But as we think about systems of exploitation, we have to say, if you look at Maharani's journey on the island shore, but if you look at the Zong, there is nothing in Caribbean history and African history that can equate to the tragedy of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans.
It's at the law court in the center of Georgetown.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yes, please. I suspect you wanted to for cover like I did.
Maybe.
No, so that struck me. And so this matter of excavation of the women in our history, and the presence of Victoria standing in the center of Georgetown. You know, in the era of dictatorship of this country, which was the era of socialism, that monument was removed. And when democracy came back, which for me is a camouflage for imperialism and for capitalism, it was returned to place of honor, you know. And so to come here to lecture on resistance, and you're speaking of women, and knowing that the only monument in this country that honors a woman is an imperialist, really has turned me upside down. I thank you for your discourse on the dialectics, the dynamics of the dialectics, and the theory of opposites.
Well, because I want to leave here safely, I am not going to get involved in Guyana's politics. I must say this though, that we have a similar scenario in Jamaica. At one point, Queen Victoria, the park was called Queen Victoria Park. It's now St. William Grand Park because we have been engaged in renaming to remove the iconic stamp of the colonizer from our landscape. It's necessary for identity building and for pride. But so at some point in our history, at that time she was facing outwards, so she was looking at us, and it was taken down. When she was put back up, she was facing inside the park and she turned her bottom to us. I don't know if it was a mistake or deliberate, but that's what it is now. But listen, she stands as a reminder of things that shouldn't have been. So I wouldn't necessarily want to take her down. I would like to take the students there and say, do you know what this woman represents? But what we must never do is leave Queen Victoria alone in the park. We must ensure that we find the women, the other women, the women who fought against what Victoria stood for, and put them to face her down. I think that's what I would do. Move from the syllabus, and instead young people in Britain should learn about Cromwell and Churchill and so on. I was interviewed on the radio and asked what I thought about that. I said, well, teach them about everybody. And I would be happy if they taught about Cromwell, because our young people would then know what colonialism was like. If you don't teach about Cromwell, you lose that part of the history. And we must know what it was like so that we can commit ourselves to never again having in the Caribbean any such structures of imperialism.
Good evening.
Hello.
Yeah, my name is Mr. Nevney. On one of the tables you had up, King Scarlett of Jamaica was sentenced to death or sentence was committed to transportation.
Yes.
Where was she transported to, may I ask?
Okay. I'm not sure, but we know that there was a tendency in the colonial period to deport. Transportation means deport from the Caribbean, usually to Nova Scotia. It could have been into Nova Scotia in Canada, could have been to Australia or to the UK. So to work or to just banish them. Because you know about the Maroons from Jamaica who were deported to Nova Scotia in the 18th century, 1896, yes, Second Maroon War. To conditions that were horrible in that part of Canada. But I think what we should leave here with about Kitty Scarlett is this. And that is why I say, how can we? They never participated in the war against slavery. Anybody who was deported, too dangerous to be left in the country. It means that Kitty Scarlett was a dangerous woman, quote unquote, a rebel woman who was not to be left to inspire. And they could have killed her, but they didn't, because to kill her would also have inspired further war. So take her away, remove her from the midst. They couldn't remove her memory, the memory of her, in the minds of the others. But I just want to show you how important people like Priscilla, also transportation for life. That means never taken back to Jamaica.
Thank you for that.
We'll take just 2 more questions.
Mr. Shepherd, my name is Marilyn Trots.
Nice to meet you.
Yes. Alisa Sensen.
I know your daughter very well, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody else here tonight. Informative lecture and the very eloquent but simple way in which you delivered it. My comment in the form of a question was the following. What are the universities of the region, not only the University of the West Indies and the University of Ghana, the others like University of Puerto Rico, University of Suriname, University of Haiti, the Consortium Graduate School, not to forget the universities in the diaspora, which have produced studies program. What are they doing to proselytize all this information about the achievements of female slaves? I know that every year, I think it is, you have an annual Caribbean Sociological Conference? Or
We have the Association of Caribbean Historians, and we have the Caribbean Studies
Right.
Association.
Should not this topic be one of the areas of focus of that? A suggestion. But we need to have this information you have put out today that for many of us it should be spread around the region so that our people can know.
Yes.
So, you know, the CXC is there, the printing press in Jamaica and so on. This information should be dispersed.
Well, I have to say that most teach women's history. We have the Institute for Gender Development Studies. We have a course called Women in Conflict Situation, and we include this kind of information. CXC has integrated gender into its history syllabus. There is a book for the students called Women in Caribbean History, which they are supposed to use if they want to do that theme or to understand that issue. So a lot of attention has been campus. We have 4 monuments now. We constructed these monuments around the bicentennial in 2007. There are 2 monuments with the names of the enslaved men and women who used to be on the plantations that have become the University of the West Indies campus. And Barbados, Cave Hill, is following that example and will construct its own monument soon of enslaved Africans who used to be on that in that area. We also have, Janice, we have a monument to indentured workers We have 2 monuments to indentured workers on the Mona campus, and we have one to the World War II, the Gibraltar camp people. So we are trying to ensure that this is not forgotten. But as I said, the problem is that a lot of people don't know the names, and so they don't know what to put up. But increasingly across the region, women's history is being taken seriously. And at the conferences each year, there's usually a panel or two on women. So this information is getting around. The problem is, and I repeat this, history is not mandatory in our schools. So a lot of young people are growing up without this knowledge.
Also about the Moran Bay uprising.
Okay.
How successful it was and to what extent?
You see, thank you for that question. And by the way, we have to begin to use certain terms when we talk about our history. First of all, let's banish the word enslaved. Because when you say enslaved, you indicate what was done to our people. Somebody did it. So let's from this evening say enslaved. Also, uprising, riot, these were wars of resistance. These were wars of resistance. So I don't say uprising. But Moran Bay, as we know, occurred in 1865. And it was suppressed, like most of our wars were, because the colonizers had more guns, they had more weapons. But I don't like to say they failed completely, because reforms took place after every single. Reforms took place after Taki's War in 1716 Jamaica. Reforms took place after 1824, the amelioration, after the Demerara War of 1823. 1831-32, Emancipation Act was passed the year after, in 1833. So there were small successes along the way, I think is how we should view this. But Moran Bay, as you know, Paul Bogle and the men and women of Moran Bay cried out for justice. They were brutally suppressed. Over 400 people were hanged. But the governor after that was forced to make reforms. There was a setback because the representative government was abolished and direct crown rule was imposed. That was a setback. But that again created a situation where activism intensified so that representative government voting would come back to our people in the Caribbean. So let's reshape our thinking about failure and success. Small steps along the way, people who are bawling out for justice, and that is what we should bear in mind. I'm growing up without it, and because I know they listen to radio, and also because I know that many people in the pre-independence era did not study Caribbean history. They studied European history, British history. I thought that in addition to teaching history at the university, I should take the history to the public space. And I think that I noticed that many radio stations in Jamaica now have some history program since I started talking history. They don't have a dedicated history program, but segments of their program are devoted to history. So the media play a really important role. I don't only talk about some of the issues. We use revolutionary songs. You heard me use two today. It's a popular one that I use when I'm looking at the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans with don't say slave trade by Aitewa. The ship was overloaded. The bread of them jumped overboard. So I use these songs to catch the attention of people and then speak about the history. And I will do that until history becomes a compulsory subject in our schools. Or until the radio station says enough done enough.
Another round of applause for history royalty. I'll now turn it back over to the chair so that we can conclude the program. Thank you very much.